You know, I've said it before. If you're the kind of person that goes to the movies and you like to be on your phone, you like to be talking throughout and just being absolutely a nuisance to everybody around you, there's only really one thing to say to somebody like you.
Your mom's a hoe.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. Hope you're all doing well, and I just want to say thanks to anybody who clicks on this video. I'm a few weeks late to this one, as this movie actually came out right as I was going to Welcome to Rockville, which is a 4-day music festival that I had bought tickets for. So it was unfortunately a reason that I ended up falling behind on covering this one, but I'm very excited to be late but still be talking about Final Destination: Bloodlines. This is the 6th installment into the franchise and is directed by Lipovsky and Adam B. Stein and stars people like Kaitlyn Juana, Briones, Kihlstedt, Richard Harmon, and many more. And as usual, before we get too far into this video, if you guys are a fan of up-to-date reviews like this, as well as early reviews, as well as retrospective reviews, live streams, and the occasional vlog, you're in the right place and consider subscribing. And as I already mentioned, yeah, this came out on a busy weekend for me. I didn't get an early screener for this one, so I fell behind on it. And I've actually never covered a Final Destination film here on the channel, but I remember seeing the first one when I was a kid and being absolutely both captivated by it but also freaked out by it, just having people die. It came out when I was still fairly young and I wasn't really as in depth into horror in the same way that I am today, but since then I've seen every other installment in the franchise, and I would say for the most part I am a fan of the Final Destination films. They're an interesting kind of film to be a fan of because I've never really gone into any of these films looking for a character or writing, but they kind of have like a guilty pleasure element to them, like a slasher in a lot of ways. You kind of go in knowing you're going to get maybe a handful of some likable characters, but mostly unlikable characters who are all just there to be lambs to the slaughter, and you are essentially just waiting to see all of the very creative kills that the creators have come up with for the film. And so going into this film, I was expecting about the same. It's been quite some time since the last installment in the franchise, so I was excited to finally sit down and check this out. And before we get into my thoughts on the film, let's get into what this one is all about. In 1968, Iris Campbell experiences a premonition of a catastrophic event at the Skyview restaurant tower, saving several lives by evacuating the venue. Decades later, her granddaughter Stephanie begins having similar visions. When Iris ends up dying after years in hiding, death resumes its pursuit, targeting surviving members of her bloodline. That's the base gist of this film without getting too deep into it, but yeah, I mean, in a lot of ways, it's another Final Destination film. I think what gives this film its own identity immediately is the fact that in the previous installments, it's always been about having, you know, one person who saw something, they had some sort of premonition, and they were able to kind of stop an event right then and there, and then death is coming for everybody who was supposed to die in that event, of course in the order they were meant to die. And in this case, you have a more interesting kind of approach of having a bunch of people that were saved that end up going on to live lives and have children and, you know, have their own bloodlines. And so we learn not only with the family we're watching here, but also with other families who unfortunately have already died, that death is coming for not only the person that survived the death, but all of the people who were not supposed to be alive at all because of the fact that now bloodlines have been created. It's both interesting, but also kind of silly because based on all the other films, none of those people should have even gotten close to being able to live lives and, you know, raise families in any way, shape, or form, or even get to the point of having a kid going through a 9-month pregnancy or anything like that. So it is a bit of a sillier premise, but I do think it gives it its own identity in a franchise that in a lot of ways has a lot of samey, tropey elements that all of these films have kind of come to know. And so going into this film, I was just looking for a good, fun time, and I think I got what I was expecting out of Final Destination: Bloodlines. I found this to be an enjoyable time at the movies, but by no means a film I'm walking out of blown away when it comes down to narrative. I can't say I cared about any of the characters or found myself emotionally connected to anything going on. I was just waiting for all of those kills, and the kills were fun throughout the course of the film. Like every other Final Destination film, there's fake outs that you can see coming, there's some kills you can see coming from a mile away, there's a couple of moments that are, you know, kind of shocking in terms of like quick deaths that you don't necessarily expect, but for the most part, you do see most of them coming. And yeah, you know, you have a mixed bag of some likable characters that you don't want to die, but of course are gonna die, and a mix of characters that are a bunch of a-holes that you expect to die and want to die. In terms of cinematography and overall filmmaking, I think that this film definitely is able to benefit from, you know, technological advancement. I like the look of the film for the most part. Some of the CGI isn't the best. I think that this franchise has always been the best when it leans into practical effects. So because this film leans so heavily into a lot of the murders or a lot of the deaths being CGI, I do think it kind of gave it a bit of a more cartoony feel to it. With that said, I do think a lot of the deaths that are practical are still really impressive in the film as well, which definitely added to some of those moments that were really good. But because it's so heavy on the CGI, I do think that even some of the best kills or best deaths in the film were only so kind of gruesome or so kind of, I don't want to say nauseating, but you know, you kind of want to cringe when you watch a film like this. And so I don't feel like that cringe factor was there as much, simply because a lot of the deaths were digital. People just kind of exploding, or, you know, you have somebody's head being smushed by something, but their face was so clearly digital. It didn't ruin the film for me, but when I think about what I want out of a film like this, which is, you know, the practical kills, just like in a slasher film, I think about the most iconic deaths that have happened in previous films, and more often than not, they utilize practical effects. And I think that's why they kind of stood the test of time. And I think a lot of those kills are the reason that Final Destination became the popular franchise that it is. So that was a bit of a bummer for me going into this film, is just seeing how much of it was digital. Though at the same time, in the modern day, I can't say I'm necessarily surprised. But again, there are some practical kills in here that I do think are pretty solid when they're utilized. As far as story and character, it's been there, done that kind of stuff. I don't think this is going to blow anybody away. I think for the most part, the characters are a mixed bag of likables and unlikables, and the story is fun enough to follow. It's a bunch of characters that realize that they're being killed off. I would say that this film, maybe more so than some of the other films, definitely leans a little bit more into the rules and the, you know, lineage of who's going to die first and who's going to die last. Whereas they have touched on those in other films, and certain characters get involved in trying to figure out who's first and who's last. But I feel like this film kind of like leaned into it a little bit more, which definitely made it kind of like a fun, like, you know, who's next kind of situation, or like, let's try to protect the next person, which did lean into certain moments that were kind of funny, especially from some of the characters who didn't expect to die. There were some moments that actually found myself actually chuckling at some of the moments between the characters, some of the banter that was going on in these high stakes moments. And yeah, you know, it was fun to kind of like see, all right, how are these people gonna die, even if it did feel predictable. Once we got to the end of the film, though, it just felt like another Final Destination film. It ends exactly as you would expect it to, and I just got up and was like, all right, that was fun enough, as the credits started to roll and I left. But I don't necessarily know that this felt like, oh wow, Final Destination is back. This is one of the better installments in the franchise. I wouldn't say by any means that it's the worst installment. There have been a couple of stinkers in this franchise, but I would say it's right in the middle. It's not nearly as, you know, kind of, I guess, groundbreaking for this genre or for this specific storyline as maybe the first one or some of the other ones that have done a little bit more fun kills. But I don't necessarily think that the storytelling is as bad as some of the other installments. So I would say it's somewhere in the middle. I think the best part about this movie in a lot of ways was being able to see Tony Todd return once again as the character he's played in all of these movies, Mr. Bloodworth. You know, it was nice to see Tony Todd. Rest in peace to Tony Todd. He's a fantastic actor, and he's been a great piece of all these movies, so I thought that it was just nice to have him in here, even if his inclusion is essentially just a glorified cameo. But you know, rest in peace, Tony Todd. It was great to see him in a movie again, and recently it's been nice to kind of see him pop up in some of these last things that he was working on before he passed away. Most recently for me, outside of this, was the Indiana Jones The Great Circle video game, which was great to have him in there. And so to see him here, you know, makes me sad just knowing that we're not getting more Tony Todd in the future. But I think there's still a couple of things that are meant to sprinkle out to have him in it, so I look forward to seeing those things. But yeah, it was nice to see him here. I think that was honestly maybe the coolest part of this movie. But yeah, overall, that's my thoughts on Final Destination Bloodlines. A fun enough movie with some pretty solid kills, some unlikable characters, a fairly generic Final Destination storyline, but something that kind of leans into a little bit more of its own identity, with the fact that you're dealing with a bloodline that's being taken out versus just people that were surviving a specific event. It did what it needed to do to have its own identity in the franchise, which I guess is all you can ask for an incredibly long-running horror franchise like this that can sometimes feel a little bit redundant and mundane. However, I do think those elements that make this franchise what it is at this point did make this film feel redundant and mundane in other areas. So I don't think this is a phenomenal film, but I do think this is a film that if you're a fan of the Final Destination franchise, you know what you want out of this. You want to just see a pretty straightforward, schlocky horror film with some solid kills. I think you'll enjoy it here. But I do wish they leaned a little bit more practical. I do wish I enjoyed the story a little bit more. I'm always going to want that with any movie. But it was fun enough, and I look forward to hearing what you guys have to say. So again, I know I'm late to the party, and probably so many of you have already seen it, but if you clicked here on the video and you got all the way to this point in the review, I'd love to hear what you thought about Final Destination Bloodlines. Where does this kind of sit for you in the franchise? Does it feel like more of the same for you, or do you think this is maybe one of the better installments in the franchise? Do you want more Final Destination? I would say after this, I'm okay if Final Destination just takes a dirt nap. I don't necessarily feel like we need more. I feel like the best ones were in the earlier years of the franchise, and I think at this point, there isn't really an abundance more to do that doesn't feel like a hodgepodge of what we've already gotten. So that's going to be my thoughts on Final Destination Bloodlines. I'll see you beautiful people in the next one, all right? Thanks so much for watching. Bye-bye.